Oh, well, friends, as always, listen, I encourage you to take notes in our series and our times together. So if you want to use the church app, or perhaps you want to use a journal and pen, if you're a little old-fashioned, I'm that way, so you're not alone. But listen, I am looking forward to just our time together today. We'll be in Mark chapter 8 this morning, if you want to grab your Bibles and skip ahead before we get there. But you see, there's this odd moment that kind of comes in the story of the Gospels. It happens in all of them. And it's this unique moment where it seems like Jesus kind of made a mistake. You ever have those moments of seeing how the Lord works or moves in something, but it's like it's half baked, it's halfway there. Like, Lord, like you're not done. Like we're not all the way through this scenario. And there's all these moments. There's all these moments of radical healing and casting out demons, and where Jesus kind of steps into the room, or he steps into a community, and people who are lame, or people who are paralyzed, people who are blind, people who are deaf, all these things, they come in, and Jesus lays hands and heals them, and people are celebrating. And these are so many of the stories of the Gospels. There's a moment where it kind of halfway gets there. You see, leading up to it, Jesus and his disciples had just fed 4,000 people a bunch of food. We know the moment where Jesus feeds 5,000 people, then there's a second moment that comes after it where Jesus feeds 4,000 people, right? And this beautiful moment, like similar to the first, where there wasn't food for everybody, but Jesus was there teaching, and people were listening, and people were there, and they were hungry. And in that moment, Jesus says we should feed them. And they look around, and like the time before, I mean, it's silly. Jesus had already done it one time. But his disciples are like, where are we going to get enough food for this? And sure enough, they do the same as before, where they take some bread and some fish and they multiply it. Well, after that moment, Jesus and his disciples are traveling down the road, and there's this silly moment where they forgot to bring leftovers, where they're hungry, right? Like they were so busy taking care of like all the people, where they forgot to like hold on to a few leftovers for themselves. And so they're actually walking down the road, and they begin to fight with one another, just like toddlers or teenagers in the back seat of the car, just like bickering and like, he's breathing on me and all this stuff. And I mean, they just begin to fight, like, why didn't you bring food? You're supposed to bring the food. Like, what? You weren't doing anything. And Jesus just like hushes them, like, what are y'all doing? And they speak out. They're like, listen, no one brought food and we're starving. And then Jesus in that moment just has I mean, we would call it a come to Jesus moment, but he has a come to him moment, right? And he has this moment. It's in 8:17, and he says this. He says, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? And how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? This moment where Jesus is kind of laying it on thick to him, like what are you all doing? Are you that dull? The one who multiplied all this food is standing there in front of them, but they'd rather bicker and blame each other than just look to the one who displayed his great love of trying to win people's hearts. It wasn't for oohs and ahs or party tricks or gimmicks. It was to win people's heart, and they missed it, even his own close disciples. Well, you see, as it continued down the road, I imagine that they have these words in the back of their mind that Jesus shared, these ears that can't hear and eyes that can't see, and what does this mean? And they come across a small village called Bethesda, and Jesus and his disciples, they walk in. They, again, like times before, people come and meet them who are asking to be healed. And there's this gentleman who is blind. And what's unique in this moment is that Jesus actually takes this man by the hand and leads him outside of the village. That way it's just this man and his disciples and a handful of others. And Jesus spits in his eyes, lays hands on his eyes. He's done all this with other people, and then heals him. And then he asks him, do you see anything? It's not so often that Jesus asks for an assurance. Like, did this work? Like, can you see? And oddly enough, the man says, in the next line, he says, I can see, but I see people and they look like trees walking around. And I have to imagine there in this moment, the disciples are a little dumbfounded because they're like, normally it just works. Like normally when Jesus does all of this, there's no like, what do we do now? There's no problem that has now arisen. It is all said and done. The miracle has happened, and so all these people who are witnessing are even confused. And Jesus, again, when he hears this, and everyone in the circle hears this, Jesus puts his hands on his eyes again, and sure enough, prays over him, and the man can see just fine and heals him after that. And Jesus didn't make a mistake. He was trying to get a message across. A message that he had just shared. He had just challenged his own disciples in the previous moment as they were heading towards the village. This challenge of just because people's eyes work does not mean that they can actually see clearly. In this moment, the man's eyes were given ability to perceive and take in images and pictures, and there's all sorts of scholars and biblical commentators and who write all sorts of perspectives of this, but in the most basic sense of this moment, this man can now see. His eyes are working, but he can't see clearly. And this is pointed right at the disciples, the ones who saw him multiply food, but didn't look at him to feed them. Well, they continue down the road because the moment's not over. Perhaps they go back into Bethesda and they care for more people, but perhaps later that day they continue to journey on along. And then there's another moment that comes. There's another moment where as they're walking down all there together, just Jesus and his disciples, he asks them, "Who do people say that I am? Who do people say that I am?" And he has this moment in Mark 8:28 through 29, where they actually respond, and they all together, this is not just one or another, but they all are responding. They reply that some say John the Baptist, others say that you're Elijah, and still others say that you're one of the prophets. And he looks at them and says, "What about you?" he asked. "Who do you say that I am?" And then Peter answers, "You are the Messiah." I love how in this moment they all perhaps were a little bit afraid to respond. But Peter speaks out on behalf of the group. What's fascinating is that Peter and the rest of them are then kind of instructed by Jesus to keep this quiet, to keep it to themselves, to not go on and share this quite with others. And I have to imagine they begin to be confused. They've been waiting for so long for the one that God has promised to come, and he finally is here. He is finally right in front of them, and with no hesitation, no leniency in Peter's voice, and no even disagreement from the group of like, maybe it's still up for debate. No, they say that you are the Messiah, even though they say this out loud. Jesus recognizes that their eyes perhaps are working, but they can't still see clearly. They still can't see really what is happening. And that comes especially to the surface in this next moment that we're going to camp out at for a while today. Because in the next moment, as they're continuing down the road, kicking more rocks and pebbles under their feet and looking at different animals in the fields next to them as they're journeying down this dirt road, it says that he begins this conversation with them. In verse 31, it says that this is Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Like, do you see what is happening in this moment? They couldn't believe what Jesus is saying. They in one moment say that you're the Messiah, it's clear, we know who you are, but in the next moment when he explains what is going to happen next, they're like, are you sure? Like, do you sure you got it right? I mean, Peter in this moment is correcting him. Like a child that gets it wrong, Peter's trying to say, Jesus, maybe we've been out in the Middle East for a while. The sun is hot. Like, maybe you're just a little dehydrated and you're starting to imagine things. Or we haven't been to Chick-fil-A in a while, so maybe your stomach is just gurgling. And like maybe you're just in a place where you're not thinking right. Like, Jesus, are you sure? Because there's no way. Like, you're the Messiah. You're the one who is meant to come and alleviate this oppression from Rome. You're the one who's supposed to come and take care of the people. What kind of joke is this? That you would die and that you would be in the grave for 3 days and then rise again? What are you saying right now? And at that time of the world, it was kind of common, kind of shared common, ideas of death, that where people believed that when someone was dead, it took 3 days for their spirit to leave their body. So when they first died, in the great words of like Princess Bride, they were just like mostly dead. And then after 3 days, then they were dead, right? After 3 days, their spirit left their body. And so they hear this, and they're like, what are you talking about? That you would die. You'd rise from the grave? What are you saying? You can't do that if you've been dead for a few days. And how can you bring your people back to the top? How can you help us overthrow Rome? How can you restore your kingdom of Israel? And now Peter speaks, but everyone is thinking it. Because remember, at this moment, they have been following Jesus for a little while, but not all that long. They're perhaps somewhere in the midst of halfway through or a year into following Jesus out of their 3 years before leading up to the cross. And so understand that as they hear this, it is like, are you sure? What's fascinating in that moment is that Jesus actually responds in a way that perhaps you already know. He says in verse 33, but when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. Now, he was speaking to Peter, but he was speaking to all the other 11. He says, get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. He tells them point blank, your eyes are not seeing. Your ears are not hearing. You don't have in mind the focus and the mission of God or the concerns even then of God. You have inside your own human earthly worries and concerns, and the two are not the same. And Jesus is trying to get them to understand this. You see, I am all too convinced, friends, that we too, even as people who say we believe in God, that we're Christians and we come to church, sometimes perhaps in our life in the past or even in this place of wrestling where we are now, we fall into these moments where, sure, our eyes are working and our ears work, but they aren't really hearing and they aren't really seeing. And there seems to be this common struggle, this common wrestling among people where we don't really understand the real significance of the cross. The number of times I've been asked, even by people who believe, like, did Jesus really have to die on the cross? Was it all that necessary, is language that sometimes we use. We know the verbiage. We know just as well as Peter and the disciples could reiterate that Jesus is the Messiah. We know that, yes, the cross is how Jesus paid for our sin and set us free from sin. We have all those things in our midst and we can say them out loud. But sadly, much of our life seems to reflect more of a disconnected, abstract even, and more of kind of, that seems a little extreme. It doesn't seem like it fits in with the rest of what I know to be true about walking with Jesus. And understand this moment of Jesus pointing to the cross and pointing to his death and pointing to his resurrection. This moment happens 3 times in the Gospels. This is the first one. And in each moment, Jesus says something rather unique about it when he is kind of reminding his disciples that this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. And in each moment, he says something very specific that people in humanity need to understand about what he's trying to accomplish in the world. And what better time of the year than on the edge of Easter, getting to lean into each of these moments. And so for today and the next 3 weeks, we'll talk about these moments where Jesus points his disciples and he points our eyes to the cross and trying to help us see something that we perhaps have been missing, that we have perhaps allowed to slip or fall into a back burner part of our core identity as people following Jesus. You see, much like Peter's reiteration of he's the Messiah, but then he goes on to tell Jesus what he should do as the Messiah. We let God know that we believe in him. We believe that Jesus died on the cross for our sin. He came to rescue us. But we too often default into letting God know how he can best be God for us and how Jesus can rescue us and how we even need to be rescued. And friends, through this journey together, I really want to allow God to bring to us a deepened sense of what the beautiful cross means for us. And why when we see it, it should create this burst within inside of us of gratitude and thankfulness. Just as Jesus is trying to peel off the blinders to Peter and the others, perhaps Jesus can do the same work to us right now. You see, they had in mind their own concerns, looking to Rome as their problem, looking to their lack of resources as their problem, looking to their lack of privilege or their lack of opportunity as problem. But what we've known, actually, we've spent the last 7 weeks prior to today, we've spent 7 weeks in the book of Romans all pointing at what the problem is. That there is sin inside of people that needs to be eradicated. A cancer in the human heart. A toxin that destroys more lives in families and people than imaginable, and is one that is very much alive and well in the soul of every human being, regardless of culture, skin color, language, gender, any of that stuff. And understand that sin is evil. We like to create this kind of hierarchy of what's bad or what's worse than one another. And certainly God is clear in Scripture that there are certain things that we do in life that bring about certain consequences or harm into our person. He especially, all throughout Scripture talks about sexual sin and how sexual sin is one that affects us in ways that other things don't affect us and harm us in ways that other things don't harm us. But nonetheless, aside from that and how it affects us, all of sin is evil, and sin at its core is selfishness. Understand that. We often talk about it in churches as this thing over there that we sometimes kind of fall into. No, it is this thing that is alive within us that needs to be dealt with, this beast that is raging, and it is selfishness, this darkness. And all of it is wrong. And we have to understand is that we are born into sin. And we live a whole life apart from God and in sin. And we die in sin. And it brings apart all of this stuff. It brings stuff into our life that is so painful and so agonizing and is frustrating and it hurts. Like it brings, understand that the way that God teaches us what is good and what is not good for us is not just this some abstract sense of morality. It is what is genuinely good for our person, for us. It's genuinely good for those around us. You see, understand, in the same way that our society looks at evil and requires justice to be made right, our selfishness requires justice. And with justice comes judgment. In our society, it's a buzzword to say judgment. People often, when we get in conversations talking about Jesus, they say, you're not supposed to judge me. Jesus said, don't judge others. And what God said was, don't look down your nose at other people. Don't lift yourself higher than other people. Don't dehumanize and degrade people. That's what he says. But judgment is simply evaluating, simply discerning, simply making a decision between one or the other. And to judge is a normal part of our human life. It's what we do in so many moments when we order at restaurants, or we're trying to choose someone we like, or even a job, or whatever it could be. We make judgments often. It's a normal part of our life. And understand that in the case of judging sin, it is to evaluate if it is good and bad. In the case of judging the selfishness of people, we know the answer. So we're guilty. Understand that it doesn't matter how many wells in Africa we build. It doesn't matter how many homeless people we feed. Our selfishness is still there. And you've heard me before use the illustration where if I handed you a glass of water and I put one drop of toilet water in, let's just even say I clean the toilet, we would still say, no, I don't want that. We would say it's dirty. Friends, I'm echoing this. We have been echoing this for weeks now because it is totally opposite of the world we live in, and we have got to get our bearings right in this. Understand that, yes, we can aim and be good people in the world, but when it comes to whether we are fully good or perfect, we are not. And we can aim to dilute our sin, but understand that no good deed erases the times that we've hurt other people, the times where we've hurt ourselves, we've hurt God. So if we're guilty, then what is the punishment? What comes at the end of our life when we die in sin? Well, we spend forever apart from God. And Jesus knows this. It brings God no pleasure to see people cross into death and spend forever apart from him. It brings him no joy. It breaks his heart. Understand that. And even as people who are Christians, like we deserve that too. It is not just like the world out there. Even we deserve that too. But this is right here when Jesus says you don't see the concerns of God. In this moment, as he's talking to Peter, he says, you're so worried about a splinter in your finger, but your leg is missing. And Jesus is trying to wake up his people, trying to wake us up to realize that this is our human experience apart from God. We are born in sin, and we live apart from him and in sin our entire life, and we die in sin. And when that happens, we are forever apart from God. And Jesus came to change that, to create an opportunity for people to finally be in heaven with the Lord, and in their life, no freedom from addictions and habits and regrets that they cling to, and things about themselves that they cannot stand. Such a bigger problem than the Romans. It's a problem inside of people, and to fix this, and Jesus chose to take on the guilty verdict in the most horrific way possible, So you understand that the process of crucifying people was invented hundreds and hundreds of years before Jesus. Actually, even before the Roman Empire, somewhere between 500 and 600 years before Jesus, we have historical documents that show that the Persian Empire used it regularly to execute their criminals. There's ideas of where it came from other nations before that, but nevertheless, we see how Alexander the Great, when he kind of developed the Roman Empire to become this prestigious nation in the known world, he adopted this way of executing criminals, this death sentence that he saw this other nation do. He integrated into the Roman Empire. And so sure enough, when they had criminals commit horrible crimes, they were then sentenced to the most horrific and terrible way to die. As they would be sentenced they would actually be given this massive wooden cross that they would carry up onto a hill or some place. And it wasn't just in Jerusalem. They would do this in all sorts of places around the Roman Empire. And they would carry the cross to their place, and they would then, it would be laid on the ground, and spikes, these large nails would be driven through people's arms and feet. And then they would be lifted up, and they would die. Not from anything quick or immediate, but from slow bleeding from their wounds, starvation and dehydration, and they would progressively begin to suffocate more and more and more as every minute passed by. And we know of documents and times where people could live up to 4 days. They would live up to 4 days when being crucified. Sometimes to speed up the process, they would break legs or they'd do other things to help hurry it along. And you know what is? I don't even have a word to describe it. I want to say fascinating, but it doesn't even do it justice. Is that the creator of the universe knew that mankind would create this horrendous execution style, and he would choose to come into the world when he knew that it would be given to him. He didn't come before the crucifixion was invented. He didn't wait till it was later on not used. The Bible teaches us that Jesus came at the most opportune time when the message of him would reach the widest audience, and he knew that this barbaric way of killing people would be used against him. And understand that is one of the core things that the cross is meant to show us, is the cost of that freedom we have from sin. It is costly. It is by no means something that Jesus just did on a bored Friday. Something that just kind of came along and it was no big deal. It was excruciating. And it was so painful. And it cost him everything. There's this old TV show from the 90s called Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman. Dean Cain is the kind of the actor who plays Superman in it, and it's extremely cheesy but also wonderful at the same time, right? And perhaps if you grew up then, you love watching those shows, or even later now watch them, but there's this one episode where, as most superhero movies go, a subway train is going to run away, and so it's going and going and going, and people are crying, oh no, we're going to die, oh no, we're going to hit the end of the tunnel, oh no, and then all of a sudden Superman goes to save the day. And with the wonderful and terrible cheesy effects of the 90s era of cinema, Dean Cain as Superman gets in front of the train, and then he just puts his hand on it and slows it down. No scratches, no bruises, no pain in any way. And the people cheered, "Oh, thank you, Superman." And he flies away. God looked at the train humanity was on, speeding as fast as it possibly could off the edge of a cliff. And not just people out in the world, but you and me. Understand that. And he got in front of it to stop it. And it wasn't easy like Superman. It was terribly painful. And that is why this season is so important for us to look at Good Friday and look to Easter and be remembered of how costly it was for the King of the world to come and be subjected to such torture and harm. Why would he do it? John 3:16, one of the most well-known Bible verses, we know that God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him would not perish but have eternal life. Later on in the Gospel of John, he says, there's no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends. And in that moment, he looks to his followers, he says, you're my friends. He looks to anyone who follows him, who places their life in him and trusts in him. Understand that the cross is meant to show us, yes, the cost of the freedom for our sin, but to very much show us the great depth of God's love for us. Wow. That moment changed everything. For Peter, and for all the others, that moment as they weren't sure what was happening as Jesus was being nailed to a cross, they would soon thereafter discover the great thing that God was trying to accomplish in the world. And I have to imagine later on, they just almost had these moments of just apologizing to Jesus and to God and saying, Lord, I'm so sorry that I asked you to do something so small. I didn't see what you were trying to do in the world and in history. I had my mind set on the things that I was worried about and not on the things that you were worried about. I was complaining about a splinter in my finger, and I was ignoring the fact that my leg was missing. You see, and as Jesus shares this with his disciples, there's something rather challenging that comes next. Because I don't want us to miss the full sense of the moment. Sometimes when we read through the Bible, we see all these headings and chapter numbers, and so we kind of cut off our reading there. We forget that it is one continuous document, this one continuous writing, that much of the time all these moments are one moment. They are one scene in a movie. They are one thing being played out together. And you see, the moment's not done, because as Jesus goes about rebuking them and telling them that they don't have the concerns of God but the concerns of people, he actually goes on to say something else. He says this in verse 34. He says, as people were listening at this time, he says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Could you imagine hearing that? Because on this side of history, we know kind of the sense of what God is speaking to. We know as the story of Jesus on the cross, but in this moment, they're still a little confused. And then they hear this language of taking up their cross. There weren't multiple meanings for that. It was one clear meaning, that they would take it up and that they would then follow him. For whoever wants to lose their life, whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the angels, with the holy angels. Understand, as Jesus is teaching in this moment, he's trying to layer and help them to understand that in the rescue mission of what he is going to do on the cross, it is not just to give a stamp or a get out of hell free card or some sort of thing that he would just kind of give to people and let them loose to live out their life, that he would actually bring them into freedom. Understand the beautiful nature of what Jesus is trying to get us to realize about the cross. My goodness, is that we would wake up to our sin and we would follow him and understand that this is true for me. This isn't just as we think of people out in the world. My goodness, this is for us. That we would wake up and see the cost of our freedom, that we would see the depth of God's great love and how far he would go to bring us home. And that we would wake up to our sin and that we would follow him. Forgiveness for our sin is so costly. But oh my goodness, it is so free to us. I didn't grow up in church. I actually grew up as a kid who made fun of people for believing in God. But then throughout the course of our family life, as things were falling apart and chaos was ensuing and just selfishness was raging and pain was happening, I was angry, this angry young kid. You see, in high school, we started going to church. My mom would bring myself and my younger brother. We'd go to church, and oddly enough, we'd only been going there for a few weeks, and then she signed us up to go to a summer camp. I'm like, Mom, what are you doing? We barely want to come to church, and now you're going to send us to this church camp? We don't do that. Well, so I go, and I'm a part of this thing, and then wrestling with God. And you see, I remember at this camp, the worship was impactful, everything was just beautiful. But while we were there was actually this exhibit. It was called the Jesus Story. We kind of think of perhaps the video that's been used, or the movie that's been used around the world. But it was this walkthrough exhibit that was made. Because sometimes we kind of view God as this one who is just, this kind of statue of ceramic, and we view Jesus even in all these stained glass pictures of him with flowing long hair and this glistening beard and perhaps even white skin and this perfect robe and all these things we see in culture. As we walk through this Jesus Story exhibit, you need to see the hardship that he endured. You need to see the life that the King of the world would be born into. He wasn't born into a family of great wealth, but he would come and be born into a barn. Be born into a family that was in poverty and struggling. Be born into a family that would go through all the things that were hard. And Jesus, at some point in his life, even lost his father, his earthly father, Joseph. The pain that he experienced, the ridicule from people, and even his own family, the times that he was betrayed, and the physical pain and trauma dealt to him through the cross, all of which more than willing to endure. That way he could set each and every one of us free. Friends, understand this time of the year, it is so important for us to lift our eyes and see. The cross is not just this cool image that goes on tattoos on our body or bumper cars or things. It is this beautiful thing that at one time in human history was despicable, but has been made new by Jesus, by the body of God. Here in the world, the church, we have turned this around to be a point, this figure of celebration, to see, wow, the King of this world would not walk away. It would take on so much, just on the off chance that we might love him back. He did it with no guarantee. He did it with no extended warranty. On the off chance that people actually might love him in return. Friends, my hope for you today as we lean into this moment of Scripture, we begin to see the beautiful significance of the cross. And it does something inside of us. It does something inside of you. Because for me, as an angry 15-year-old kid, It was actually following that Jesus story moment where I decided to give my life to Jesus. And through a few years of high school and other battlings and other wrestling, would say, God, you have full license in my life. Do whatever you want with me. Friends, God wants to use you. As a pastor standing in front of you, I am by no means perfect or deserve any of this. I deserve hell. I very much do. But by the grace of Jesus, I have been set free. And I have been made new. The same is true and available to you. Friends, I don't know where you are with God, but I urge you not to make this about just going through the motions and checking off boxes of what good Christians do. But allow this message of pick up your cross and join him and follow him, that it would seep into your soul.